I think all three of you touched on some really important points. And I know Matt is going to want to get in on this next section as well. While we have Brian Nickel, an important point that you made, Pastor Kevin Lee, and you also made it as well, Brian Lauer, is that the hydroplate model does not require as many miracles, perhaps unnecessary miracles or events of supernatural intervention, as the catastrophic plate tectonics model. And so one major point that the catastrophic plate tectonics model appeals to a miracle for has to do with what's called the heat or radiation problem, or both, that basically catastrophic flood processes, including accelerated nuclear decay at the flood, if you put that at the flood, would release far too much heat, energy, and radiation that it would have cooked the planet, boiled the oceans, and killed Noah and the animals. And so most proponents of catastrophic plate tectonics that I've spoken to over the years doing seminars and live programs, most of them have appealed to a miracle. They've argued that God would have supernaturally intervened and removed the heat and radiation. Does the hydroplate model require supernatural intervention or a miracle to remove the heat and radiation, or no?
No. Walt comes from a background where he did lots of failure analysis. And I actually was involved in failure analysis in my career back when I worked for a major defense company. And that's where you learn everything, because something's gone wrong. And what Walt's trying to do is use failure analysis to select the best theory based on the evidence. And that's simply what he's applying. That's why at the back of every chapter, he has the red, yellow, green light kind of color coding, comparing all the theories, because that's exactly what you do when you have a problem in an engineering situation. And a hydroplate is never going to turn to a miracle in order to support the theory. And there's a reason for that. Think of a theory as a bridge being built, and every abutment that's holding up that bridge is some line of information or a mechanism or something that's explaining the theory that's keeping the bridge propped up to go from what you're saying initially happened to what you're saying the results are that are the observed evidence. Okay? And in the ideal, you would have rock solid scientific evidence and mechanisms underneath everything supporting the bridge. But let's say someone comes along and somewhere down the line in their abutments, one of their supports, they say, oh, well, this is a miracle that God did. I found evidence that God did a miracle right here that also happens to align with my weak point in my theory. Okay, so whatever. Great, good for him. Let's take that theory. Now, what about theory 2? What if somebody else comes along and throws a different line of evidence of a miracle of God underneath another different part of their theory that also happens to be weak in a different spot in their theory? How is any of us going to figure out which one's the right one? Which set of miracles are the right ones? It's just, once you start adding miracles inside of your theory and you just abandon cause to effect reasoning and trying to base it on the science that you know, it's not a question of whether or not God could do a miracle. As Christians, we believe he has the ability to do them. But when he hasn't recorded it in his word, we need to be very careful about just proclaiming miracles that happen to also align with where our theory is weak. So hydroplate theory is never going to appeal to a miracle inside the theory and say, heat left because God made it leave. That's the slippery slope, and that is just, you're lost in a sea of relativity at that point. And there's no way for a layman or a scientist to be able to decipher which set of proposed miracles is the right one for the theory. So that's just, it's ridiculous. I mean, you're not science anymore once you're doing that. So hydroplate theory is an open system. So the simplest explanation, without taking a ton of time, is hydroplate theory provides an open system to the flood scenario. We're proposing that fountains were ejecting material. They were and the the thermodynamic processes of expansion of a fluid cools the fluid. But not only that, the fluid is predominantly, most of the fluid and material in hydroplate theory never came back to Earth. It's out there with what Kevin talked about. So we have an open system that is, it's ablative in its nature. So ablative surfaces erode, and one way to keep heat from entering a system is to use ablative surfaces. And hydroplate theory, the speeds there are so high that heat can't transfer. It doesn't have time to transfer out into the atmosphere or into the rock or whatever, because the fountains were ablative in nature, and they were taking material out before it could ever pass its heat on. So all the heat is getting blasted up into space and never to return. So that's the short of it. The hydroplate theory proposes that the open system that is proposing is the key to explaining heat leaving and not overwhelming the Earth.
Brian, if I could give one follow-up, and then Pastor Kevin Lee will hand it to you. And Matt, I know you had a couple follow-ups as well on this. It's an important issue. As everybody probably knows, there are popular critics on YouTube of young Earth creation in general that have put out popular videos claiming that the heat problem is the death knell of young Earth creation. And Brian, you made some excellent points there. And therefore, I'm curious how you would address this possible rebuttal. And so Tony Reed, an adamant critic of young Earth creation, in his video on the hydroplate theory, and if I remember correctly, in Gutsy Gibbons' video response as well, they said this, and then I'd be curious to see how you'd respond, about sending a lot of the heat into space. So their argument is that since heat is transferred well through steam, and wind does a good job of spreading steam around, the heat from the fountains of the great deep breaking open would have cooked the planet. But in terms of how we might respond, they say that since a lot of the superheated water would be released into the atmosphere, 2 of the 3 methods of heat transfer do not exist in space: conduction and convection. And since all that is left is radiation, which they argue is the weakest of the 3 methods, what would get rid of all that heat? So in other words, they're basically arguing that space would not be a good means to remove a lot of that heat, Brian.
Well, whatever that argument is, doesn't appear that whoever is saying it has any kind of understanding of fluid dynamics or thermodynamics or aerodynamics. And I don't know, those are such broad and unrefined statements. I mean, to say that, there are thermodynamics charts that anybody can go look up and ask those questions of, if you don't have that, ask AI. Hopefully it'll give you a valid answer. But I mean, you can go to any steam table and any heat transfer textbook and look up the properties of steam, look up the properties of carbon dioxide, look up the properties of air, and compare them all. And whether one of them is better or worse than the other, actually air is, well, I have to look at a chart just off the cuff. I don't want to speak wrongly, but I think that to say that steam is a better conductor than air is to miss the point that both of them are gases, and gases are horrible conductors of heat. They just are. You can take any of the major materials for preventing conduction, right? Like asbestos and whatnot. Any kind of insulation, and a still gas will outperform it greatly. So to get wrapped around the axle whether air or steam would be able to somehow conduct better in the atmosphere is ridiculous. Again, this also is completely ignoring the ablative hypersonic nature of the fluid that's flowing through the stagnant atmosphere. The atmosphere, every particle in the atmosphere will have an attraction toward those fountains. So the heat cannot pass through all of those molecules and make it through the atmosphere. It will not do it. And the idea that steam can somehow rapidly turn 90 degrees as it crests the top of the plate and go sideways 90 degrees and blast out into the atmosphere, it just speaks to unfortunately a great ignorance of the topics that they are expounding on.
Okay, Brian, I appreciate that detailed answer. Very good. Pastor Kevin Lee, go ahead.
Yeah, going to your first question, the hydroplate theory as far as accelerated decay, heat, and everything else, all the thermal energy is going into a subterranean chamber. All the neutron flux that Dr. Brown talks about that would have been generated, and we know there was a neutron flux because of the deuterium, meaning heavy hydrogen, that was in the subterranean chamber. The only way you make deuterium is a neutron, what we called in the nuclear world. I was trained in nuclear physics associated with being on a submarine. Neutron flux hitting water is attenuated by the water and gives its heat to the water, and that thermal energy building up in the subterranean chambers, as Brian already pointed out, and I've watched his thermal video, and he mentioned earlier that as soon as that supercritical water is exiting the throat and going up the channel, it is depressurizing. And when you depressurize a compressed gas, because at that point, all that is, the supercritical water is now just pure gas as it's depressurizing, which we would call steam, except that when you depressurize it from 400,000 pounds per square inch as it's going up, all of its energy, thermal energy, is being converted to kinetic energy. And as Brian, chime in here, but I think you said 5 kilometers up, it's already cold, right? So by the time it's coming up to the crust, at the exit of the crust, it's cold gas. I was also a Navy diver, and they put us inside of they wanted to let us experience a decompression chamber. So they got us in a chamber. They pressurized us up, and everybody is sweating like crazy because it got so hot, because they only pressurized it a few feet of air pressure, and then when they depressurized to let us out, there was a cloud inside. Imagine 400,000 pounds per square inch depressurizing a gas. As Brian was saying, the person making that comment does not know thermodynamics, heat transfer, fluid flow. They don't understand what's going to be happening. And so all the thermal energy that is going into the subterranean chamber is coming out as kinetic energy. The heat that would be generated would be accelerating rock that's falling into the debris. As soon as you accelerate that from 0 to 7 miles a second or 4 miles a second or whatever it's going to be, you're going to create heat. And but the escaping supercritical water is cold, and then it's going to go up into space. If it goes up into space, space is a perfect place to get rid of heat. You've got the entire universe it's radiating into, and so there's not a heat problem. And going back to I'd like to say more on the on the invoking a miracle. I was talking to Jay Seegert a few weeks ago, talking about our possible roundtable discussion. And I said, I have it. I find it difficult to understand why somebody that has a theory that has increasing problems with the theory, both biblically and scientifically, can't just abandon the theory. I said, because if 25 years ago, I gave Ken Ham in Colorado, when I went there to meet with him and others that were right after the Columbine massacre, because that's where I grew up, is right there at Arapahoe Community College, where the event was. And I gave it to Ken Ham, the original comet chapters, an asteroid chapter. And he goes, "Oh, that Walt Brown's doing no good for the creation movement. He believes mammoths are blown up into space." And I said, "Well, you don't know what you're talking about." And it was almost that animated. And he's doing nothing. He's just a lone wolf doing nothing for the creation movement. And I told Jay Seeger, I said, if they would have sent a space probe up there and it's a solid rock that's 1.5 miles, if it's a solid rock that's more than 200 meters across, and maybe 300 meters is a limit, and there's nothing from Earth, no sign, no anything, I'm done. Like Brian says, hydroplate theory people aren't wanting to just enjoy our theory, but we're doing it because the evidence is supporting it. If the evidence doesn't support it, and it's supporting it in every way, especially as a pastor, I don't want to be standing before God having preached something that is a lie. And I know it's a lie if the evidence doesn't support it. So,
Pastor Kevin, I appreciate those points. I'm curious. And firstly, before I get to my follow-up question, there's a couple of good comments here. For example, from Hydroplate Theory, appreciate it. Lots of good talks on this channel. And he's made some good analogies, but he's also made this important point that the heat that would be inside whatever material from the Earth is ejected into space, that material would take the heat with it when it flies away. But I'm curious because the critics usually point to the heat and radiation generated from accelerated nuclear decay as being the biggest challenge. And so my question is, does the hydroplate model look to or hold to accelerated decay?
Yeah, we do. That's what the radioactivity chapter says. And you guys, you and Matt, did a great job of explaining that the Proton 21 project shows that the original distribution of all the elements and their associated isotopes is adiabatic.
Right.
It isn't going to create all the heat because it's being done by Z-pinch. It's being done by an extreme voltage, and I have a demonstration on Z-pinch that I should have brought here. If you take really fine, anybody can do this, take really fine copper wire and pull the insulation off of it and solder it to 2 connections and hook it up to a battery and allow it to short out. I mean, a car battery. And you let the strands of wire be separated from each other. And as soon as you short it out, all those strands just collapse on each other. It's Z-pinch, but not at the scale that's happening inside the crust, where you have so much of a compression of the protons in the nucleus that they superfuse. They fuse together the nucleuses, and then they explode apart into all the elements of the periodic table and some of the isotopes. And they did it adiabatically, meaning thermally neutral.
Thermally neutral.
And you guys talked about that, and a few weeks ago, I think, right?
Yeah, we did. We did a point-by-point rebuttal to Gutsy Gibbon, who believes that the so-called heat problem destroys young Earth creation. But as you guys are showing, there is not a heat problem. According to the hydroplate model and a lot of the points being made here, important points, there's no
I think it's important to
either. Brian, go ahead.
I think it's important to make a clarification too, is when we're referring to the Proton 21 Lab's work and the adiabatic nature of the process. It's the heat that would be required to generate the radioactive materials and the heavy elements is adiabatic, and that's during the Z-pinch, where you're in the zone of the collapse of the subatomic particles into like the hot dot. That part is the adiabatic part. But when that's over, it's going to release a whole bunch of X-rays and a whole bunch of stuff, and then also it's going to fragment. It makes a hot condensed egg, basically, and basically the work is happening on that, in that it's arranging particles into more and more arranged nucleons. But then those those fragment back apart, and when they do that, they are releasing a lot of heat as well. It's just that we're proposing is happening in the water and being absorbed. That release of energy is being absorbed by the water, and then the water is carrying that stuff out of the system predominantly. So that is
totally agree. Totally agree. And just like I said,
we don't want to say that the whole process is adiabatic, because hydroplate theory, and what Walt proposes in his radioactivity chapter, and anybody can go on, and I tried to explain the radioactivity chapter in a video that anyone could go to. I wish I was more clear in that part of the statement even in my video. So, but it's important to be clear, because what Walt's claiming in the chapter is that the energy release after these nuclear reactions is what's powering the fountains over time. So it's not a completely adiabatic process. I just want to make that clear.
And I totally agree. Are you hearing me?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And I totally agree. And I even just said some of those processes are neutrons. Those neutrons are going to be depositing all their energy for all that is going into the water, and the other decay. But the main energy there of the adiabatic, the decay energy is going to go in, but it's going in to keep the fountains at hypersonic speeds with the supercritical water energy.
Kevin,
cool.
do you mind, Kevin, explaining why it is that the water is? I can do it if you want, but I mean, there's a reason that the water trap those neutrons better than other surrounding materials, like say the rock or whatever.
Yeah. And this is really important too. And again, on a submarine, you have different kinds of radiation coming from the reactor core, and they have different shieldings. And one of the shieldings, everybody thinks lead, you want to use lead. Well, you don't use lead on neutrons. Lead will do nothing to neutrons. It doesn't, because it's too heavy, because those neutrons that are going out of the reactor, they hit a lead. It's like a pool ball hitting a big bowling ball. It's going to scatter off with the same energy. But if you have a pool ball hitting another pool ball, then you're going to impart that energy to that other pool ball, like we see when we play pool. A neutron is a one atomic mass unit. A hydrogen atom in water is a one atomic mass unit. It's the proton that's there. So it's hitting. So neutrons are shielded by water, and they impart their energy in water. That's what, years and years ago when they were talking about building a neutron bomb. The ideal part about a neutron bomb is you could have a deep bunker with a bunch of concrete and steel and whatever else, and you could kill everybody inside, but you wouldn't do the damage to the area around, because the people inside are made of water. So neutrons are the worst kind of radiation to get, because it basically turns your body to hydrogen peroxide, because it's hitting the water in your body and it's chemically messing with you. And that's how you kill people with a neutron bomb. So the energy is going to go into the water. And it just so happens that throughout the crust, there's a lot of water during the flood of Noah, and it's going into the water.
Basically, the flood has three generations of heat that it's coming from. One would be these underground chambers where the supercritical water is, and the generation of these radioactive elements. And now one of them is the piezoelectric effect that's causing it. When we see these experiments, they use what's called Z-pinch, which is plasma. But there's lots of different types of cold fusion. So is the type that's creating these radioactive elements in this supercritical water, is that a different form of cold fusion? Is there because in the experiments, right, they zap copper, and that's what forms them all. When this Z-pinch is occurring in the supercritical water with granite from the crystals, is there what is it striking? Probably just elements from the granite surrounding it.
That's a good question.
Well, I
I
think
don't know. I haven't heard if Proton 21 tried using an aluminum probe, an aluminum rod, or what happens if you do it with granite? I mean, I don't know. Maybe Brian knows,
I
but
think that
huh?
the Proton 21 is using metals. I think probably because they conduct so.
Yep. Yeah. Yep. You'd
Right.
want to do something that
It's like there's a bit of
electricity can travel through best, because that's what's going to happen. Electricity is going to take its path of least resistance.
Great.
Brian Nickel, I think you were finishing your thought and then you cut out. Are you still there? Can you hear us, Brian? Okay, we may have lost Brian. Maybe we'll give him an opportunity to come back, because it seemed like he was in the middle of a point and then he just suddenly roboted out. Matt, did you have a follow-up, brother?
Yeah, and the other Brian's gone too.
Yeah, I think the other Brian Lauer may have had a connection issue, but Brian Lauer, that is, if you are listening, you should still have the link. So if you're able to get things back up and running, feel free to rejoin and we'll let you in. Matt and Pastor Kevin, and then if Brian Nickel makes his way back in, we can get him involved. I'm curious as to the nature of the origin of radioactivity. Is it 100% necessary to have what's taking place there in terms of Z-pinch during the flood, or can that take place during the creation week to basically mitigate any accelerated nuclear decay effects? Or would that be negative because God said everything was very good, so to have radioactivity at creation would be not very good? I'm curious to see what your guys' overall thoughts are on that. Maybe we can start with you, Pastor Kevin.
Yeah. Radioactivity is not good for us. We're trained in that. We do everything possible to not let radioactivity get into the environment as nuclear workers in the shipyard, submarines, wherever. And it's actually something that carbon-14, we learned from carbon-14 that our bodies are having thousands of disintegrations per second, or per minute, I think. I have to go look at the numbers, where our cells are taking in carbon. And there's a certain percentage of those carbons in our environment that are carbon-14. And they're going to decay at the carbon-14 half-life. And so when a cell, DNA, RNA, whatever, is taking in some carbon to become part of our bodies, and all of a sudden it turns to nitrogen, it didn't want nitrogen. Chemically inside of that cell, you just damaged the structure that God miraculously created us with. And I think that is the reason why the longevity of the human species took an exponential decay after the flood, is because radioactivity got introduced. Not, it used to be taught back in the canopy theory days that, there was a canopy and shielded us from the solar radiation. Well, I have 3.2 rem of occupational radiation, which would have been, and if you look at 100 rem per year as a normal, that means I've got 30 years of extra radiation because of working in the Navy. But I hope I don't look 100 years old. So it's not radiation that you get from the outside. It's when it gets into your body. The radionuclides get into your body and do the damage inside. And so then people will say, well, Kevin, carbon-14 is made by the solar radiation in the upper atmosphere. And so there would have been carbon-14 before the flood. And that's true. But Walt says, and he and I talked about this personally, but Kevin, there was so much more carbon on the earth at the time, and there was so much more atmosphere at the time. And so it was very much less carbon-14 in the carbon environment that everybody was eating, veggies and whatever else. And then I throw this in, this isn't what Walt said, and maybe that's the reason why there was the tree of life that was in the garden, is it was God's way of man to just be able to go eat of the fruit of the tree of life and be set free. Because in chapter 3, after the fall of man, God sends an angel to get Adam from being able to get the tree of life, because in a sinful state, he would live forever. So he would be able to bodily get whatever healing there was from the tree of life. And so man no longer has access to the tree of life. There's a lot more radiation in the environment, and they exponentially decay down on the longevity of man, I think is the best biblical explanation, and tied to the flood. And I was going to say one more thing about that, which I'll get it back here in a second.
Matt?
Yeah, do you think that there would be any radioactive material in the core of the Earth? Because a lot of people say that it's fueled by the rotational power of maybe potassium or maybe uranium, and that's what's coming up in the lava now.
Well, several things with that. People wanted radioactivity in the core for their analysis of the things that were happening, the heat and the convective currents and all that stuff for plate tectonics. There's no evidence of radioactivity in the core. I mean, even the secular scientists are admitting that. There's no evidence for it. Plus, and this would have to be for a different time probably to get into the trench chapter, which deals with the fact that there was no hot core before the flood. The evidence suggests that the inner core and the liquid outer core, the melted mantle material, were formed during the flood at the compression event. The imbalances that were placed on the Earth caused the Atlantic ridge to rise up, which sucked the Pacific side, and all that relative movement between, with all that extreme pressures and inner Earth moving by itself caused the massive melting of the inner Earth. And the higher temperature minerals in the mantle came, as the rest of the stuff is melting around it, the higher temperature iron, nickel fell to the center to become the iron nickel core of the Earth today. And all the evidence supports that, including the fact that the inner core is not spinning at the same speed as the outer core. And in fact, here's an article that scientists warn shortest day in history is coming in weeks as Earth rotation unexpectedly speeds up. This article this article is answered by the hydroplate theory. And you mentioned that liquid magma is coming up to the Earth's surface. The CPT people say that, the PT people say that, but science, and we're talking over a dozen independent scientific investigations, including the Japanese, which are the ones that Walt put in his book and I've done in previous presentations. As soon as you get 220 miles down in the Earth, the pressure is so extreme that mantle material, basalt, in the solid state is less compressible than liquid state. So as soon as you're below let's say 300 miles, as soon as you're 300 miles down, the solid basalt mantle material is compressed, but its density is right where it is. It's at 300 miles down. As soon as it melts, it compresses now. The mineral structure, once in a liquid state, allows it to compress and the density to increase. So there's only the only magma that is ever poured out on the Earth's surface, volcanoes on the ocean floor, on land or wherever, all that magma came from 220 and less miles. There's volcanoes that are going on in the liquid core right now. If you could be in the liquid core, you'd be seeing volcanoes erupting from the ceiling of the mantle coming into the liquid core. But that can't happen until the liquid core pushes up a mantle block somewhere that causes an earthquake somewhere else in the world. So there's magma columns in this article. This is the one that I gave to Dr. Baumgartner and asked him, because this disproves the cold subducting plate by full waveform Full waveform inversion reveals diverse origins of lower mantle positive wave speed anomalies. They say in there that now that we're using an MRI in the inner Earth instead of an X-ray, we're seeing density anomalies that are blowing us away, that we have no explanation for. That Anton Petrov, he did a YouTube presentation on it, like back to the drawing board, and where they're finding these density anomalies, because they're not looking at the fact that when mantle material melts, it becomes a higher density. And so the earthquake waves are going to go through a higher density and an area in the mantle. And they're going, why are we seeing this? And we're setting up for a global earthquake. And we're seeing the beginning, I think, because I think we're in the last of the last. I think we're seeing the beginning of it. In our time, I mean, everybody's freaking out. Why are we getting all these volcanoes? And why are they getting these earthquakes? And why is the eastern rift of Africa splitting apart? All explained by the hydroplate theory.
Yeah, isn't Yosemite right now acting anomalous and the animals are fleeing? Like right now?
Yellowstone or Yosemite?
Yosemite, I think. Yosemite.
I didn't hear about Yosemite. It must have been today or something.
Yeah, last few days the animals have been fleeing. But I haven't looked into it much, but not good news.
Yeah.
Okay, so
science says that CPT, PT cannot happen. It cannot. Magma unless you do need a miracle to throw an axe head into a lake and then you want it to float. You got it. That's a miracle. And that's a miracle in the Bible. But you have to invoke a miracle to get any magma from greater than 220 miles to come up to the surface of the earth.
Wow, I got to say, I am impressed with the knowledge here on this panel. Great detailed answers to technical challenges, technical questions, but this is what we need. We need thorough and we need comprehensive responses to what the critics are saying on this so-called heat and radiation problem. So what I'm gathering, gentlemen, and Brian Nickel, maybe you can have Brian Lauer. It's good to have you back, brother. You've been kind of in and out a few times.
I'm having some, the internet's kicking on and off. So I don't know how much time I have. So going back to the heat thing, I don't know if you can share my screen real quick, Matt. I don't know if you can do that.
There you go.
I encourage people to go into rsr.org and go into RSR Answers, the hydroplate theory problem. And you go down and they got a whole list of the problems that answers it. Fluid cools rapidly as they expand. That's a Joule-Thomson effect, and it's directed energy. Brian Nickel has his hands next to a 2,000 foot torch, and it's not burning them. And the boundary conditions, it's not impacting the whole atmosphere. It's just shooting up like crazy. And then you guys can check that later. And yet outer space is a big heat sink. And you can check that later. Adiabatic. And then the heat crust problem. Walt Brown says the heat energy gained by supercritical water simply increases the pressure, velocity, and number of droplets, all of which then increases the heat removal. Because as it expands, it's going to cool down. And significantly, the hotter the supercritical water becomes, the more the water molecules break into ions. So thermal energy becomes colder electrical energy. And then the heat energy gained by supercritical water simply increases. Oh, I did that already. And then it talks about there's a shutoff valve. Once the temperature reaches about 1,063 degrees Fahrenheit, the piezoelectric effect disappears. So it's not going to be sparking once it gets that hot. And then I'd like people to watch this experiment.
Would I dare to take this glove away? Yeah, easy. Easy, no problem. Hot or cold? Begin with a C.
See, so as it expands, it cools off. And so that's the heat thing. And then if you want to stop the screen share, I'd like to. Oh, wait a minute. Yeah, am I off here? Okay.
You're good, Brian.
Yeah, I'd like to. When they were developing plate tectonics, and that was in the '60s, and they knew nothing about the ocean floor. And Christian Smoot, he was mapping the floor for the Navy, and he wrote this book. He couldn't say a lot because it was top secret, but now he wrote this book, Tectonic Globaloney, and he says plate tectonics does not work. And so when you tie your theory to the secular, your theory to a creation theory to a secular theory that does not work, we're in trouble. We should be making our own theories. And he says that subduction does not occur. And he says purveyors of plate tectonics are the present day snake oil salesmen. And then it's misinformation, misconception. So I encourage people, if they want to get all the information, check out that book. And then also 20 Reasons to Question Plate Tectonics. And get all the information. And people, we should be discussing this stuff. And so that was my 2 cents I wanted to get in before my internet crashed again. So thank you for letting me do that. And I'll let you guys go back on to where you were.
That was great. No, I appreciate those 2 cents. The main critic's response, which Brian Nickel, I think you addressed sufficiently, to the links or resources that you provided, Brian. The main criticism was, well, space is not a good heat sink because all you have in space is radiation, which is the weakest of the 3 methods. And so no heat, you can't answer the heat problem with space. But Brian Nickel, I think you addressed that quite well earlier.
Well, I think that it doesn't, whether radiation or conduction or convection, if radiation's, if you want to call that the weakest, I guess when you say something's the weakest, it's in what environment, right? Like in space, radiation is king. So it's not the weakest. It's just absolute best for heat transfer. So it's ridiculous. That's why in I don't mean to be harsh, but it doesn't sound like questions that are or critique that is coming from somebody who understands flaws. It just doesn't sound like they are knowledgeable of what they're asking. The other thing is so much of the material that left Earth didn't come back. So whether radiation was the weakest while something's traveling out past Jupiter or Neptune, like it just doesn't matter for the Earth anymore. And that's why the open system that's proposed by Walt is the key to why the flood is explainable without being overwhelmed on Earth with heat. And I am working on a video that has been, it's on 6 years now. And it's not that there's not an explanation or that I'm taking 6 years because I'm having trouble explaining in terms of trouble finding the science that explains it. I will say the 6 years is trying to figure out a way to present the material in a easy to digest way that everybody can understand, who doesn't need, so that you don't have to have an engineering degree to comprehend what Walt is proposing. And I think a lot of the critique is due to a failure to comprehend what Walt is actually proposing. And that seems to me to be the case with a lot of these critiques where they're focusing in on whether steam is more conductive than air or whatever. I mean, anybody can go look at the properties of conduction of steam and you'll see that air actually is less conductive than steam through a great deal of temperature range. I think you have to get up to 900 degrees temperature for the steam to start to outperform air in terms of thermodynamic conduction. So again, it's just, it doesn't sound like these critiques are coming from a source that is understanding what it is that they're critiquing.
Yes,